There's a question that sits underneath almost every relationship we've explored throughout this entire series, one that rarely gets asked directly, even though it's the question that actually matters most once you've understood everything about how these dynamics work. It's not, why did this happen to me? And it's not, what's wrong with them? It's simpler and considerably more useful. Why me specifically out of everyone this person has ever encountered? And what would actually need to change in order to stop being chosen for this particular role, not just in this relationship, but in every relationship that might come after it. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be honest about something right at the start. This isn't a video about becoming someone harder, colder, or less generous than you already are. If that's what you're expecting, you're going to be surprised because the actual answer to this question has almost nothing to do with becoming less of who you are and everything to do with understanding exactly what being a target actually means mechanically, so you can finally stop being selected for it without sacrificing the very qualities that make you who you are in the first place. Let's start by dismantling a belief that keeps a lot of people stuck longer than necessary. The belief that being targeted repeatedly across multiple relationships, multiple friendships, multiple work dynamics means there's something fundamentally broken or flawed about them specifically. This belief is understandable, especially after a pattern repeats enough times that it starts to feel less like bad luck and more like some kind of personal signature, something other people can apparently sense on sight. But this belief, however understandable, is based on a fundamental misreading of what's actually happening in the selection process. And correcting that misreading is the entire foundation everything else in this exploration will be built on. Here's what's actually happening. People who repeatedly find themselves targeted by manipulative, narcissistic, or exploitative individuals are almost never being selected because something is wrong with them. They're being selected because something is genuinely valuable about them, something that, in a healthier context, would be recognized and treated as exactly the asset it actually is. Deep empathy, a tendency toward generosity that doesn't require immediate reciprocation, a capacity to sit with someone else's difficulty without needing to fix it or flee from it, a willingness to extend trust and goodwill before it's been fully earned, because that's simply how connection has always felt natural to build. None of these qualities are flaws, but every single one of them, without a corresponding set of protective boundaries, functions as an open door to exactly the kind of person who has learned, consciously or not, to recognize open doors and walk through them. This distinction matters enormously because it changes the entire nature of the work required to actually stop this pattern. If the problem were your fundamental worth, your fundamental lovability, some deep flaw requiring repair, the solution would involve becoming a different person entirely, which is both impossible and, frankly, the wrong goal, even if it were possible. But if the problem is actually a mismatch between genuine, valuable qualities and insufficient protective structure around them, the solution looks completely different. It doesn't require becoming less generous, less empathetic, less willing to extend trust. It requires building the protective structure that was missing so that those same qualities can finally exist safely, offered selectively rather than automatically, protected rather than exposed. Let's talk about how targeting actually works, because understanding the mechanism precisely is what allows you to interrupt it deliberately rather than simply hoping, this time, that things will somehow turn out differently. People who repeatedly exploit others aren't typically choosing their targets through careful, deliberate analysis, sitting down and consciously evaluating who might be easiest to manipulate. The process is usually much faster than that, almost intuitive, built on pattern recognition developed over years of similar interactions. They're watching for specific signals, and the signals they're watching for are worth naming directly because once you understand exactly what's being scanned for, you can start noticing when you're unconsciously broadcasting it. The first signal is speed of trust. How quickly does this person extend goodwill to someone they've just met? Do they need evidence of trustworthiness accumulated over time, or does trust arrive almost immediately, offered generously, before there's been any real opportunity to earn it? People who target others for exploitation are specifically drawn to fast trust because it means less work is required to gain access to whatever they're actually seeking, whether that's emotional labor, financial resources, unpaid effort, or simply an audience for their own needs. The second signal is responsiveness to guilt. This is worth understanding precisely because it's often invisible to the person exhibiting it, even though it's remarkably visible to anyone specifically looking for it. Some people respond to even mild unearned guilt by immediately trying to fix whatever discomfort has been implied, apologizing for things that weren't actually their fault, over-explaining decisions that never required justification in the first place. This responsiveness is like a signal flare to anyone paying attention because it reveals almost immediately that guilt can be used as an effective tool to produce compliance long before any other, more obvious manipulation tactic would even need to be attempted. The third signal is difficulty tolerating someone else's disappointment. Watch how someone responds when they say no to a request and the other person's face falls, even slightly. Do they hold the boundary, allowing the other person's disappointment to exist without immediately trying to soften or reverse it? Or does the boundary collapse almost instantly the moment any visible discomfort appears on the other side of it? This particular signal is one of the most reliable predictors of vulnerability to exploitation, because an inability to tolerate someone else's disappointment means boundaries were never actually going to hold under any real pressure, regardless of how firmly they were stated in the first place. These three signals, fast trust, responsiveness to guilt, and difficulty tolerating disappointment, aren't character flaws. They're often the direct result of upbringing, of earlier relationships that taught specific lessons about what keeps connection safe, of a genuine, admirable desire to avoid causing anyone unnecessary pain. But understanding that these signals exist and understanding that they function as detectable information to anyone scanning for them is the first real step toward interrupting a pattern that has likely felt up until now like something happening to you rather than something you have any real ability to influence. This is where the actual work begins, and it's worth naming clearly before we go further. Stopping this pattern doesn't happen through a single decision, a single confrontation, or a single dramatic transformation. It happens through the deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable practice of changing how these three specific signals get transmitted, not by eliminating trust, guilt responsiveness, or empathy for disappointment entirely, which would require becoming someone considerably less kind than you actually are, but by recalibrating exactly when and how much of each gets extended and to whom. Understanding exactly what this recalibration looks like in practice, what specifically needs to change in how you build trust, respond to guilt, and hold boundaries under the pressure of someone else's visible disappointment is exactly where we need to go next. Let's start with the first signal, fast trust, because it's usually the earliest point of vulnerability in the entire sequence, and recalibrating it changes almost everything downstream. Here's what needs to be understood clearly before we talk about how to actually change it. The goal isn't to stop trusting people. Trust is one of the most valuable things you have to offer another person, and a life built around withholding it entirely produces its own kind of isolation, one that isn't actually safer, just lonelier. The goal is to change the timeline on which trust gets extended so that it becomes something earned through observed, consistent behavior over time rather than something granted immediately based on how someone presents themselves in the earliest, most carefully managed moments of a new relationship. This distinction matters enormously because those earliest moments are exactly where manipulative people tend to perform most convincingly. Early charm, early intensity, early declarations of how rare and special this connection feels. None of this is reliable information about who someone actually is because it hasn't yet been tested against time, against inconvenience, against moments when performing well requires more effort than the person is genuinely willing to sustain. Practically, this means building a specific habit, noticing when trust wants to accelerate faster than the evidence actually supports, and consciously slowing it down, not out of suspicion or cynicism, but out of a simple protective principle. Real character reveals itself through consistency across time and circumstance, not through how someone behaves in the specific window when they're actively trying to make a strong first impression. This slowing down often feels uncomfortable at first, particularly for people whose natural inclination has always been to move quickly toward connection, because slowing down can feel, subjectively, like withholding warmth, like being less generous than you actually want to be. It's worth naming this discomfort directly, because it's one of the most common reasons people abandon this practice before it has a chance to actually work. But there's an important reframe available here. Slowing down the pace of trust doesn't mean withholding warmth in the moment. You can be genuinely warm, genuinely engaged, genuinely present with someone new, while still reserving deeper trust, deeper vulnerability, deeper investment for later, once their behavior over time has actually demonstrated they're worthy of it. Warmth and trust are not the same thing, even though they often get conflated, and learning to separate them is one of the most practical skills available in this entire process. Now let's talk about the second signal, responsiveness to guilt, because this one requires a slightly different approach, since guilt tends to arrive as an automatic physiological and emotional reaction rather than a conscious choice you're making in real time. You can't simply decide in the moment to stop feeling the discomfort that arises when someone implies you've disappointed them, especially if that discomfort has been a reliable feature of your emotional landscape for years. What you can build instead is a pause between the feeling of guilt and the action that used to follow it automatically. This pause is genuinely the entire mechanism, and it's worth understanding precisely how small it actually needs to be in order to be effective. It doesn't require minutes of careful deliberation. It requires a few seconds, sometimes even less. Enough space between the guilty feeling arriving and your mouth opening to apologize or over-explain. Enough space to ask one simple internal question. Is this guilt actually proportionate to something I did wrong? Or is it simply proportionate to someone else's visible disappointment? This question matters because it targets the actual confusion underneath this entire pattern, the conflation of someone else's disappointment with your own wrongdoing. These are not the same thing, even though they often feel identical in the moment they're happening. Someone can be genuinely disappointed by a decision you made without that decision having been wrong, unreasonable, or something requiring an apology. Learning to hold this distinction clearly, even under the immediate pressure of someone else's visible unhappiness, is what eventually interrupts the automatic guilt response that manipulative people have learned to rely on as one of their most efficient tools. Let's talk about the third and final signal, difficulty tolerating someone else's disappointment, because this is often the most difficult of the three to recalibrate, precisely because it requires tolerating genuine discomfort in real time rather than simply adjusting an internal thought pattern. This is worth naming honestly, Learning to hold a boundary while someone else is visibly upset about it is genuinely uncomfortable, and it doesn't stop being uncomfortable just because you understand intellectually that it's the right thing to do. What actually changes with practice isn't the discomfort itself. It's your relationship to that discomfort, your willingness to sit inside it without immediately acting to make it disappear. Here's a practical way to think about this shift. Every time you hold a boundary despite someone else's visible disappointment, and the relationship survives that moment, meaning nothing catastrophic actually happens as a direct result, you're gathering direct evidence that contradicts the old belief that boundaries and connection are mutually exclusive. This evidence accumulates slowly, and it's worth being patient with how slowly it accumulates, because years of the opposite belief don't get overwritten by a single successful boundary. But each instance adds up, gradually building a new, more accurate internal understanding that someone's disappointment, uncomfortable as it is to witness, doesn't actually require you to abandon your own reasonable limits in order to resolve it. Now let's talk about something crucial that ties all three of these recalibrations together, something rarely discussed with enough precision. The specific effect this recalibration has on the people who used to target you versus its effect on people who were never actually a threat in the first place. This distinction matters enormously because it addresses a fear that often surfaces during this process, the worry that becoming more protective, more measured, more willing to tolerate someone else's disappointment will somehow damage your genuinely healthy relationships, making you seem colder or less trustworthy to people who never deserve the caution you're now extending to everyone equally. Here's what actually happens, and it's worth understanding clearly because it consistently surprises people the first time they experience it directly. People who are genuinely safe, genuinely invested in your well-being, genuinely capable of healthy reciprocity, respond to slower trust, boundaried guilt, and held boundaries with patience and respect, not with escalating pressure. They don't need you to trust them immediately in order to feel secure in the relationship, because their own security was never actually dependent on your immediate, unearned trust in the first place. They can tolerate the pause before your apology because they were never trying to extract an apology you didn't actually owe them. They can tolerate your held boundary even when it disappoints them, because their respect for you was never actually contingent on you abandoning your own limits every time those limits became inconvenient for them. But people who were specifically drawn to you because of fast trust, guilt responsiveness, and boundary collapse respond to this recalibration very differently. And this difference is exactly what reveals, with remarkable clarity, who actually belonged in your life and who was simply exploiting the absence of protective structure that used to surround these genuinely valuable qualities. This difference in response and what it actually reveals about the true shape of your relationships once this recalibration takes hold is exactly where we need to go next, because understanding this difference is what transforms this entire process from a defensive strategy into something considerably more valuable. An accurate, reliable filter for determining who actually deserves the depth of connection you have to offer. Let's examine that difference directly, because it's the clearest, most reliable piece of information this entire recalibration process can give you, and it deserves to be understood in full before we bring everything together. When someone who is drawn to your fast trust, your guilt responsiveness, and your boundary collapse suddenly encounters a version of you that no longer offers those things as freely, their reaction rarely looks like patience. It tends to look like escalation, an intensification of exactly the tactics that used to work reliably, applied with more pressure, now that the usual easier route has stopped producing the usual easier results. This escalation is worth understanding as diagnostic information rather than as a personal attack, because that reframe changes how you experience it in the moment. If you slow down the pace of trust and someone responds with increased urgency, increased declarations of how rare this connection is, increased pressure to move faster, to prove you feel the same intensity they're claiming to feel, that urgency is not romantic, it's data. It's telling you directly that this particular person's interest was specifically tied to your willingness to move quickly, and that interest is now under threat precisely because you've stopped moving at the pace they were counting on. If you build a pause before automatic guilt-driven apologies, and someone responds by increasing the emotional intensity of their disappointment, adding more weight, more implication, more visible hurt in an attempt to bypass your pause entirely, that intensification is also data. It's revealing that guilt was never simply an unfortunate side effect of the relationship. It was, whether consciously deployed or not, one of its primary operating mechanisms. This is precisely why this recalibration process functions as such a reliable filter, and it's worth naming this function directly, because it reframes something that might otherwise feel purely defensive into something considerably more useful. You're not just protecting yourself from exploitation, though you certainly are doing that. You're also simultaneously running an accurate test on every relationship in your life, current and future, one that sorts people cleanly into two categories based on how they actually respond to your new pace, your new pause, your new willingness to hold a boundary despite visible disappointment. People who pass this test, who respond with patience, respect, and genuine willingness to build trust slowly, are showing you through direct behavior rather than through words that they were never actually threatened by your protective structure in the first place, because their own investment in you was never dependent on you having none. This brings us to something worth naming clearly, because it addresses the deepest fear underneath this entire exploration. Does building this kind of protective structure mean permanently losing access to the depth of connection that made you who you are, the fast intimacy, the immediate warmth, the generous, open-hearted way you've always approached new people? The honest answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no, and it's worth sitting with the nuance rather than rushing past it. You won't lose your capacity for depth. What changes is the sequence in which that depth gets offered. Instead of extending full trust immediately and hoping it gets honored, you extend measured trust first and allow full depth to develop naturally over time, specifically with people who demonstrate, through consistent behavior, that they're actually capable of holding it responsibly. This isn't a diminished version of connection. In many ways, it's a more accurate one, because it's built on real information rather than on hope and projection, which turns out to produce relationships that feel considerably more stable once they finally do develop, precisely because they were tested along the way rather than assumed from the very beginning. Now let's talk about what happens to your own internal experience once this recalibration becomes stable, because this is where the deepest and most important insight of this entire exploration finally comes into full view. Something shifts in how you move through the world that goes far beyond simply avoiding exploitative people. You start to experience your own kindness differently, no longer as something automatically available to anyone who asks for it, but as something valuable, something that gets extended deliberately, with discernment, in a way that actually increases its meaning rather than diminishing it. This shift often surprises people because there's a common assumption that protective boundaries make kindness feel smaller, more restricted, less generous. What actually happens once this recalibration becomes fully integrated tends to be the opposite. Kindness that's offered selectively, based on genuine assessment rather than automatic reflex, feels more meaningful both to the person offering it and to the person receiving it, precisely because it's no longer being extracted through pressure, guilt, or manufactured urgency. It's being given freely by someone who has actually chosen to give it. This is the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. Stopping being someone's target was never actually about becoming a harder, colder, less generous version of yourself. It was about finally building the structure that should have existed around your generosity all along, structure that protects exactly the qualities that made you valuable in the first place, rather than requiring you to sacrifice them in order to stay safe. The empathy, the openness, the willingness to extend trust and grace, none of that was ever the problem. The problem was that these qualities were operating without any protective boundary around them, freely available to anyone who happened to recognize how to access them, regardless of whether they deserved that access or not. So if you've spent years wondering why this pattern keeps repeating, why you keep finding yourself in the position of the one who gives too much to people who give too little in return, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored today. You were never chosen because something was wrong with you. You were chosen because something was right with you, something genuinely valuable, offered without the protection it always deserved. Building that protection now doesn't mean becoming someone less generous, less warm, less capable of deep connection than you've always been. It means finally becoming someone whose generosity is met with the same care it was always worth, because you've learned, deliberately and sometimes uncomfortably, to require that care before extending the deepest parts of yourself freely. That shift, once it's genuinely complete, doesn't just stop you from being a target. It fundamentally changes the entire landscape of relationships available to you, because the people who used to find you so easy to access simply stop finding easy access here at all, while the people who were always capable of meeting you with equal care, the ones who were quietly present all along, patient enough to wait for a version of trust that was actually built to last, finally have the room they needed to become visible. You were never the problem this entire time. You were simply unprotected, and now finally you're not.